Hey everyone, it's awesome to be here. I'm like almost, getting teary-eyed seeing reading dry farm so many times and having and seeing so many other people that are into dry farming. It's really, really cool because it's probably my most passionate horticulture endeavor that I do with my tomatoes, which is usually about 25% of what I do. But anyway, this is awesome. Anyway, I'm Joe Schirmer. I own Dirty Girl Cruz. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Joe. I'm gonna have to interrupt. I think we're gonna need to use your backup audio. Thank you.
Sorry. Let me go here.
We deeply value every word you share.
Yeah. Good video. You hear me here?
That's sounding better. Thank you.
How's that?
That's great. Thank you so much, Joe.
Okay. Um, okay, yeah. So 40 acres right now. I've farmed Dirty Girl since '96. I was also props to Centerstone's Garden Project. That's where I got my first little horticultural fix as a undergrad at UCSD. And then I just never left it. Once I saw what people were doing, I just thought it was so cool. And in '95, I did the agroecology program at UCSC for Jim Lee, who was Uncle Jim, was doing some dry farm tomatoes, and he was doing them on 6-foot centers, and he was cultivating, both ways perpendicularly. And I just was blown away. I grew up in Santa Cruz, and we had Molino Creek. We had dry farm tomatoes, but I didn't pay any attention to them. But when Jim was doing them, we were watching them grow and everything, and then we tasted them. I was like, that was it. That was like really, really interesting for me. And so I worked on a few other farms, ended up hooking up back up with my good friends, Jane Freeman, Allie Edwards, who had started Dirty Girl Produce in '95. And then they moved on, and I kept farming. So I just kept the name Dirty Girl, kind of to, keep, people that mentored me at the front of what I do. And yeah, 40 acres. I probably had somewhere around 15 different properties that I have farmed on in Santa Cruz County, from sandy loam to clay to all over. And one thing that's interesting that I saw in the presentation about the heat and the moisture and everything is that I live in Santa Cruz and in the city, but in Santa Cruz County, it's Watsonville, Corlitos, part of Aromas, and these are in the far eastern part of the county. It's a totally different microclimate. We have many different microclimates in our county. It's pretty crazy. And up against the hills, we have a very distinct. It's not in Western Garden. It's probably should be called Zone 17 Banana Belt or something like that. And it's coastally influenced. If you go on the other side of the hills, you will get the garlic capital of the world, Gilroy, that they're claiming. It's hot and dry. We're coastal. It really reduces the temperature, but also we're pulled back with a little bit out of the fall. You're right on the coast, which is probably where all that data was taken. It's totally different microclimate than where we grow tomatoes. And I have picked and leapfrogged on all these properties over time, really to get property that soil and microclimate that will grow dry farm tomatoes. Because if you dry tomatoes, I can still grow strawberries, lettuce, I don't know, it's the farm box from whenever.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if I'm not sure if you're using your phone or what, but the connection sounds like it's loose. You keep breaking up. Is there a way for you to just use your phone for the audio? Apologies, everybody. It seemed like
Sorry, guys. How's that?
Oh, I think
How's
that's going to
that?
be so much better. Yeah, I thought
Okay,
we were
yeah.
getting better there, and then we lost track. So
I'm sorry. Yeah, I can't see my photo, my Zoom, but we're gonna look at the slides anyway, probably. Um, Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm on my iPhone now. So yeah, the climate for dry farm tomatoes, and of course, it's so cool to see everybody that are working in nonprofits and in colleges and different things like that. I am beholden to the mighty dollar in the operation that I'm involved in with Dirty Girl. So So we have to grow something that makes money, that people want. And I've found, the greatest success in anything that I grow. Of course, I grow year round. We never stop. We grow all kinds of veggies. But the dry farmed early girl tomato is by far the most, popular thing that I've grown as far as bringing in the customers. And we prove it every season by cutting them up and giving people samples that have never tried it, people that are just used to a tomato. And I love the horticulture. I'm a horticultural geek, but I also have to be, a business owner. So what's interesting about dry farm early girls, right, is that they're a hybrid. You have to buy the seed every year. You can't grow out the seed. And of course, they were owned by many companies that owned Monsanto. And so they were thrown into the debate with Monsanto always. And there's no longer Monsanto, but it's interesting that I got really thrown into that conversation as someone who dry farms. There we go, tomato hacker. I love that because it's funny because they called me a tomato hacker, but I didn't do anything. The plants did everything. All I did is went out and selected, right? I did that almost like, you're on a computer and you're hacking, you're breaking apart things as though I went in and took the genetics and decoded them, right? I just selected. So what I did, years into it, I noticed that we would have years where we would try to get early girl seed and you couldn't get any. And we're like, what is going on? Call all over. I'm getting like small seed packets coming from all over the US to accumulate enough to grow, back in the day, like 3 acres, now we grow about 10 acres a year of dry farm tomatoes. And, I started digging around and I found that once Monsanto came into the picture and bought out Seminis, they took all their domestically produced hybrids, which theoretically there's nothing wrong with a hybrid, right? You could grow a hybrid organically. And I have a friend, Uncle Fred Hempel, who does artisan seeds. He produces, he's a PhD, he does this. And so, but the problem is the production. They control the means of production. Of course, you can get a patent that'll go out. Yeah, funny. RIP Monsanto. You can get a patent that lasts like 20 years or whatever, and then early girls, it's expired, right? So, but you still control the means of production because you have the two parents, right? So what happened, Seminis, Monsanto, these big conglomerate seed companies, they decided, you can imagine that, hey, we're gonna make more money if we bring this overseas. So I heard at first it was in Thailand, and now I believe that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard that central China, there's this big valley that's very humid, and they're growing a lot of hoops. A lot of hybrid seed that we get in the States is from China right now. But what happens when you go overseas is then, probably whoever's inspecting the containers as they come into port, they'll take a sample and oh, you have some kind of blight. And okay, done. You'll have a full season of whatever that seed is. And of course, an early girl is a very it's popular with home gardeners, but it's not like a big, there's not acres and acres of early girls being grown these days, right? So you get a crop failure for a year, and that's what we experienced, crop failure. And I remember way back early on, it seemed almost like every 4 years that this would happen. And so, I said, God, I should have started breeding. I remember this time, like, I blew it, man. I should have started this. And that was like maybe 6 or 8 years into farming, on my own. And then eventually, what happened was I had a patch of early girls 1 year, and it was in a very narrow area. You could change the slide if you want. Give people something else there's my eldest, who's now 15, making seed packets. So there was a little area that was too narrow to put like broccoli or whatever we're putting the next year, right? And so what we did is we didn't plant it, and it just went fallow, and there's all these weeds, all these things growing in. And if you've ever grown tomatoes, at least where we are, the next year you get a ton of tomato volunteers. And there was just, 100 tomato volunteers in this little, it's probably like 50 by 15 foot area. And so I went and I kept walking by when I'm doing my field walks, and And I noticed some were really big and vigorous and kind of going, and some were sickly or whatever. So I went in one day and with a hula hoe and I took out all the weeds and I left the nice um the nice plants, and there was a bunch of really interesting plants. Now this is a hybrid that all the volunteers, and these would be the ones that fell on the ground. Maybe they had blossom end rot, maybe that, who knows, whatever fell on the ground, something ate them. These weren't the best selected. If you want to select for a variety, you probably want to get the best every year. These are the ones that are on the ground that volunteered. But I think there's a certain amount of vigor that came with that, right? And so there was one tomato plant that grew up like this, and the tomato grew like a donut around the stem. And there was another plant that grew up, and half of the tomatoes on this side, the two leaves here, the stems, they were like more like a beefsteaky kind of big round one, and they were like the other side had like San Marzanos growing on it. And like everything, I mean, it was an incredible amount of variation. This is a photo right here of an early girl seed that was saved and grown out. This is a dirty girl variety. I'm calling it that's like Choco 1 through 14. That's my middle son. I have a whole bunch of these varieties. So what I did is I went and I selected the ones that looked most like an early girl, and I tasted them, and the ones that tasted good, because the thing about the early girl in the commercial sense of the dry farm is that they are the highest acid, highest sugar, highest mineral content tomato you'll taste. Correct me if I'm wrong. Let me know. Let's do a taste test, but they really are the bomb, and it's a flavor bomb when people try them. And so I didn't want to just grow a tomato that yielded well, right? I've found that the early girl, when you dry farm them in sandy soils, or we have one spot that's right next to a creek and it's very sandy loam, and it just has a lot of access to water. It gets too much water, the plants grow too tall, and it has an incredible yield. There's big, beautiful tomatoes. I'll probably have more yield per acre on that for sure, but they don't have the same flavor. If they get too much water, then they get watery and they're not that good. It's just like when you dry farm an early girl in the beginning, the first ones are a little watery, and as they really get stressed, that's when they taste good. Of course, they start getting blossom end rot, right? Which is what led to really the production of the dirty girl, is that I started selecting plants that didn't get this blossom end rot. Right here, you see the one on the left is a nice little dime sized. That'll go on any market table. That'll go in a CSA box. That is a good tomato. Even though there's a little teeny tiny black spot in the middle, I wouldn't want to send that in a box and ship it across the country or something like that, where it would ripen in a box, because we do a bit of shipping. But the ones on the right, you can see there's variations between all these different. As soon as I call those black ones the Eye of Mordor. That ever watching Eye, you can see them on a market table. You're like, those are nasty. You could still cut them out or whatever, but I toss them. This is a problem with early girl dry farming them. When you stress them to a certain point, the yield goes down. You also get blossom end rot as the tomato transitions into being dry farmed. In the beginning of the year, there's a lot of moisture, especially up top. And so the tomato thinks it's a regular tomato. As it transitions, says, no, I'm deep. I'm only getting water deep. The bottom leaves drop. They get really stressed. The new leaves form, and they're more like pinnate. They're more, suitable for dry farming. And then a lot of times they throw these blossom end rot. And that's a problem commercially. If you're a home gardener, like, damn, well, I'll get the canning going. But commercially, you can't sell a lot of these. And it's the big problem of dry farming tomatoes, is that blossom end rot. So if you go to another slide, you'll see that canning. We have a huge canning program. I don't know if there's a canning slide. Here's our little box, little cutie box. There's a stores right here. So this is, I don't know if you can see here. Go back to the jar. I'll show you what we got. This is our dry farmed early girl. Those are just dry farmed tomatoes. Immersion blender. It's a 150-gallon steam kettle. They take off the water off the top. These other ones, I've got a clamato. I made a squid motto, which is like basically a michelada mix that we use squid instead of clams, because squid come from the Monterey Bay and actually have a better taste than clams, which are all East Coast. Nothing wrong with East Coast clams, but if you want to get some clam broth, you got to get it from the East Coast pretty much. So anyway, we tomato juice, spicy tomato, all these tomatoes, all this blemish stuff, you got to do something with it. If you just throw half of your product away, that it's just crazy, you know. And there's we sell what's called an off-grade box, and we sell more of those to retail customers than we do our A's, right? Because they're discounted, and a lot of people know that you can eat right through that little blossom end rot. And so that's a big problem. How do you deal as a commercial grower with that blossom end rot? Early girls weren't here's some tables. There's a Dirty Girl stall on the left. This is a store in Bristol Farms, I think in LA, that has a really nice sign and is displaying our tomatoes. What are you going to do with all that as a commercial grower? You got to find a place for them. You got to can them. I think we did 25 or 30 pallets of jarred tomatoes. That's a 12, 16 ounce jars. And they tend to be about, 40 to 50 cases. We did a ton of canning, and we'll sell that all through the year. The other thing is we came up with the Dirty Girl. When I selected for the Dirty Girl, it had to be vigorous. It had to have the flavor, and it had to have less blossom end rot. And I found that it was actually really easy to just, with time and years, because I only get one chance a year to select the tomato varieties, right? So I selected the vigorous plants that had a lot of fruit, that tasted really well, that looked more or less like a dry farmed early girl. Some of the bigger tomatoes that were produced didn't have the flavor. There was a lot of little ones, like I have a couple varieties, a little like cherry type, like large cherry tomatoes that are the bomb and really, really good, dry farmed. But I had to select for that. In selecting, the Dirty Girl came a little bit later, but I find that throughout the year, when you're not throwing away or having to deal with all these off grade, that you end up with about the same yield, if not more. And one thing that happens with us just in our program is that we wholesale a bunch of tomatoes, because anything farm, and there's a bell curve, right? And we can retail a steady line, but that bell curve, in peak season, we got to do something with it. So we do a lot of wholesaling. When we wholesale, we have to sort, and this is like 15 people in a converted wedding tent with tables taking buckets. I don't know if there's a bucket shot of just we palletize the buckets, put them in there, and they sort. There you go. That's buckets on a pallet coming out of the field, and they got to sort them. They do a little bit of selection in the field if they're really bad, and they know they drop them.
Joe?
But they got to sort. Hello?
Hey, Joe.
Someone say something?
I know.
Hey.
Sorry. Thank you so much. I'm timekeeping here, and unfortunately,
cool.
I've got to bring our attention to the time and move us forward. So do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to wrap us up with?
Yeah. Well, I'll just finish that. Is basically what happens sometimes when we have to sort and palletize, right? Is that we'll wait for the Dirty Girls to plump up real good, and we'll send the people. Oh, there I am. Sorry. We'll send the crew into the Dirty Girls. We'll wholesale them both as the same, because they're so much cleaner. And when you have to wait a little bit longer, but sometimes we can't wholesale because there's too much blossom end rot. It takes too much time to sort out all the stuff. So all the blossom end rot. So anyway, that's just the basic story, I think, on the Dirty Girl. I have another 15 to 20 varieties, depending on if some of them are the same varieties or what, that I'm working on, and I'm excited to put out there this year. We also have the Dirty Girl that's 2 weeks earlier.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Joe.
It looks like there is a question from Amy there for you. As you know, we've been selecting Dirty Girl for earliness up here. Earliness?
Yeah, I hear you, Amy. They're a little late. And when I see the early girls coming on, those first ones, and I see the Dirty Girls are green and their foliage, and it's like, come on. But they do end up catching up. and I do have an early variety, which is essentially just always a certain percentage of the Dirty Girls that are earlier, and so I've just saved those seeds. I haven't released that as what is that? The Dirty Girl? Is that the early girl or the early dirty? Or but I do have half of our Dirty Girl production this year will be our early variety of Dirty Girl. And I just think I'm gonna do a little bit more selection this year anyway on kind of altering, kind of getting stronger, just different traits. But yeah, I think, wasn't that Amy? Was that you that we were going back and forth in email, and I was going to send you some seed. You're going to send me some seed. I have a feeling it's the same seed, because I've seen these plants that are early, and when you save them, they come on a little earlier. But I actually like having the staggered. For us, it's good to have a staggered pick. If they all come on at once, it can be overwhelming and really, kind of stress our system out.
Great. Daryl, you have your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, what's up, Joe? It's funny, like I live now like maybe 5 minutes from, your Green Valley spot, and I love that we have to like have a webinar based in Oregon to talk. But one of the things that was always impressed in that you were working on over the years is some of the experiences with like deep shanking compost and nutrient amendments for some of your dry farming. And I know, Yvonne's on here, who I know spoke at this last year, and some of her research was really showing how we saw these kind of like accumulations of nitrogen high in the soil, that the crops weren't really using those. So, what we've done, I think at UC Santa Cruz, is started to back off some of the supplemental fertility. But I'm curious where you've gone with that process in terms of trying to get nutrients deeper in for some of these crops, and yeah, just kind of where you're at right now on that.
Yeah, totally, man. I'll tell you, I've tried just about everything that I could have thought of, right? I had one year where we, just like you said, the nutrients in the top is not really, I wouldn't say valid, useful. One time when I was collaborating with JP, I think JP, we had a patch and we grew some tomatoes, and we used a little bit of pre-plant that we use for veggies, a little bit. And so what we did when we prep, I mean, God, I could talk forever about prepping the beds, but we shank down the middle, right, of the bed, and it makes a little kind of trench. And then we go by hand and put pre-plant, which is a little pelletized fertilizer, high nitrogen, right? And then just a little, we didn't put that much. And then we planted and we sowed, and then we watered them in, because we water them in because we don't expect that we're going to get a rain to water them in, and we can't count anymore that the soil is going to be wet enough to plant into the moisture, to get by with that commercially, right? So we water them in, and here comes these tomatoes, and they're freaking big, dark green giants, and they're big foliar monsters, right? And these specific tomatoes, what happened was they ended up getting a lot of Phytophthora, which is, I don't know about Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon, might be a little drier, but we get a lot of Phytophthora here near the coast because of the humidity. And they were just blighted. It was terrible, and you don't want those big green leaves. You don't want to grow tomato leaves. You want to grow tomatoes. So we did that way back when. We learned our lesson. A lot of times now what I do is I drip them in, and when we drip them in, I'll put a cocktail in that's, usually like kelp and whatever. I've tried everything, because blossom end rot, they say, oh, it's a deficiency in calcium, but the calcium is synthesized in the roots. It goes to the leaf, and it shoots across to the tomato when it's producing, and it's all the outside, the very thin layer is very calcium rich, and that's why it gets it, is because the calcium doesn't come over. But the calcium doesn't come over because it doesn't have water. It doesn't come over because it's not calcium. So I've tried all kinds of foliar amendments to put calcium in to try. I don't think anything. Maybe get Yvonne over to do the study, but I don't think any of that stuff works. I think it's really just they're stressed, and it's the tomato, the early girl's reaction is going to drop leaves and make a smaller, tighter skinned fruit that has high acid, high sugar, high mineral flavor, and a blossom end rot. They're going to abort. Some are going to be totally aborted. Sometimes they abort their flowers. Eastern Washington, I mean, it must get so hot there. You must get a lot of flowers aborting in a lot of these varieties, because I've trialed, you know, tens of every kind of tomato I've ever heard. You know, I've tried and looked and see what they did, and they don't do well. So I've tried every kind of like foliar application, any kind of drip, any kind of pre-plant, anything that can kind of come up. And I find that it's really about your soil and what you've done in the years past, that, you know, what you, because you're farming your subsoil essentially. You know, the crop is going to be from the subsoil. The tomato leaves and the plant is maybe going to be more influenced by your topsoil, but essentially it's like a wine, more like a wine grape than growing lettuce. You know, and probably similar with you know, the cucurbits and everything that have a deep taproot. So yeah, well, I've tried everything, man, everything, and I find that you can't really, you know, we've had half of the field like, oh, it didn't get that, and well, okay, whatever, and you look and it's like the same. By the
Right.
time the fruit is producing, it's the same, because they're all down. You can't really drip. If you try to drip water soluble fertilizers in, they kind of stop. It's like a filter, you know, the water might go down, but the a lot of those nutrients are all going to stay in the topsoil. Even if you shank, because we do like at least like a triple shank down the middle of every bed to ensure that when we do plant, the roots
I'm
go
gonna
down
have to
quick
chime
and
in
deep.
here again. I'm so sorry. We're
No
gonna
worries.
have to just get you in a solid audience here. There are some additional questions that weren't addressed in the chat box, so I don't know, maybe you can hop in there and see if you want to reply to some people who are asking you specific questions. Thank you so much for your presentation.